Good morning. I'm just a few gray hairs away from my full Mr. Rogers transformation, so I'm going for that. I love Mr. Rogers. I loved it because he's really easy to understand, like really good little lessons, to walk away with and understand. And I can't help but think of the master teacher that gave lessons that were on the surface very easy to understand. Like, we can kind of get the whole, a coin lost and looking everywhere for it and then finding it, or a lost sheep that a shepherd goes out to find. And that makes sense on the surface. It's understandable. But what I hope this lesson does for you this morning, I hope it's very simple for you to understand, as Jesus often was, but I hope it challenges you deeply and in the best way. I hope it always challenges you. I hope every time you come across these passages, it just kind of sticks in your craw and you just can't get it out, and it's something that you constantly wrestle with and think about and meditate on. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at a few different gospel accounts, and we're going to discuss Generation Faithless. And I looked up the movie poster for Mission Impossible, and that's how they did it with the little colon there. So that's what I attempted to do as well. Generation Faithless. Have you ever taken a break from something only to come back and you find that whatever you left is just in complete disarray? Like it's just a mess. Like maybe it's your job or something, like you take a vacation and then you come back and like the office is backed up. Everyone's running around like chickens with their heads cut off, and it's just a nightmare, right? And you're like, I was gone for a short amount of time and it's like already gotten this bad this quickly. What on earth? It just reaps chaos like that. Well, in Luke 9:37 through 41, we kind of have a similar scene, but before we talk about that, we just read about this father with the son who's abused, oppressed by this demon that is just making this child, this poor innocent child that's a victim, just really tortured in a way. And the father goes to Jesus because he's heard about Jesus' miracles. He's heard about the healings, the casting out of demons, the teaching that the kingdom is here. And he goes to the one man that he thinks can fix his child, that can heal his child. So he tells Jesus that he tried to ask his disciples to cast out this demon, but they couldn't. The disciples failed to do so. So how do you think Jesus is going to reply to this desperate father who Jesus' own disciples just failed, and with this child who's deeply sick? How is Jesus going to respond to this man? In Luke 9:41, Jesus answered, "O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." That doesn't sound like the Jesus I think about when I think of Jesus. That doesn't sound very Christ-like, right? Like that sounds kind of mean. This guy's poor child, innocent child, is suffering, and then here Jesus responds with, "Oh, wicked and faithless generation." That's kind of an odd reply, don't you think? Well, it is when that's why you don't just rip the Bible out of context for that exact reason. So we're going to set up some context around this. As we read about Jesus' ministry in the Gospels, we know that Jesus collected this core group, the 12, right? They were disciples, apostles, right? This core inner group. And Jesus gave them and the Father authority and a mission, right? They were also supposed to go into different cities and proclaim the good news of the gospel and to cast out demons and to heal the sick. And Jesus also continues in this ministry of proclaiming that God's kingdom is here. And as you follow the narrative, the apostles continue. And in the meantime, while they're going about this ministry, Jesus takes a little hiatus, just a little break to do something very, very significant. Jesus goes up on a mountain with Peter, James, and John, and his appearance is transfigured into a glorified state. Even his clothes are shining white. So obviously, this is something that's just not normal. Like, just imagine, you think about clothes and how dirty they'd be at the time, just walking in the wilderness or in the desert on the mountains, right? You're going to have dirt, mud, and everything else all over you, right? And yet Jesus' clothes miraculously are just shining whiter than any launderer could get it, right? It's like, okay, something deeper is going on with this. But not only is Jesus transfigured into some glorious form, but he's met by heroes of the Old Testament scriptures, of Moses and Elijah, which that's pretty cool, right? I mean, since when does that happen? This is very, very odd. I'm starting to think this Jesus is not a regular man. There's something more to this Jesus. And so Jesus hits this huge spiritual peak. I want you to think about this. And in some gospel accounts, this comes right off the heels of the feeding of the 5,000. So just these amazing, powerful miracles being done by Jesus. And then he has this confirmation from the Father. Do you remember? This is my beloved son. Listen to him. And so Jesus even heard the Father's voice directly with his disciples as witnesses, that the Father is affirming Jesus and what he is doing. He's been affirmed and in some way glorified by his Father, spoken with faithful messengers of God from the past, and his disciples were continuing the mission of the kingdom of heaven to the people down at the base of the mountain. This is awesome, right? Everything is going amazing. This is awesome. Jesus comes back down the mountain, and right off the back of this experience of monumental glory, what do you think Jesus comes back to when he comes down from the mountain? In Mark 9, this is why also gospel harmonization is important, because if you read all the gospels together, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke both mention this account, it says, "And when they came to the disciples," in Mark 9, "they saw a great crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, 'What are you arguing about with him? What are you guys doing?' And someone from the crowd answered him, 'Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able.' And he answered them, 'O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me.'" It's just a very, very relatable moment, right? Like we've all... And so I think we can, with all these things in mind, we can start to understand Jesus' exasperation. Jesus has set everything up to succeed, right? He's set the apostles up for success. He's given them the authority to cast out demons. He's got this core inner group with him to go and witness this transfiguration. He's been affirmed by the Father. And a nice break, I want you to think about that, of how many thousands of people that would be following Jesus day in, day out. "Jesus, Jesus, heal me. Heal my kid. Heal this. My leg hurts. I have a demon. I need help. I can't see well." Can you imagine just being pulled every direction, hours of the day, just for hours and hours on hours of people grabbing for you, crying out to you? And just think of where he left to be in that mess. To think about the perfect state of glory where there's not pain and suffering. And Jesus is right there in the midst of it, healing it. And what does he come back to? Complete and utter pandemonium. The disciples that he sent out to go do this ministry are now over there bickering with the scribes. And then this poor man is crying out, "Heal my son." And it seems like the son has just been cast to the wayside, right? Like he's not on the disciples' mind at this point. They're just arguing. And then Jesus just comes down after this huge spiritual peak just to see the complete and utter failure on the part of humanity back down on the ground off the mountain. This is a total collapse of all the things that Jesus had set in place before he went up on the mountain. Does this remind you of something in Scripture? Remember Moses went up on a mountain and witnessed glory and his face shone. And then what happened when he came down the mountain with all these commandments and this new fervor? What are the people doing? Complete and utter failure of all that God had worked and done through them. And they just turned their back on it. It's just become pandemonium and a mess. And what does Moses do? Moses gets mad and breaks the tablets, which, then... joke's on him. He has to write them now. The first ones were handwritten by God. These ones now he has to write, so great. He broke them. But I want you to think about Jesus' response, a wicked, faithless generation. But what does he say at the end? Bring him to me. Let's fix this problem. So we can see how Jesus is a type of Moses, but a fulfilled Moses, a perfect type of Moses. But who is Jesus calling faithless here? I don't think that's a mystery. The whole generation. He says the generation, wicked and faithless generation. And yes, I agree that it applies to the disciples, but I think it applies to much more than just the disciples here. I think this is a whole picture of the fallenness, of the foolishness and the faithlessness of humans, of human beings, of what we can all be guilty of. And that's what I hope you realize this morning is we're going to look at the different audiences and we're going to try to put ourselves in which camp that we would be in. But let's not put ourselves in the Jesus camp, all right? Because you're not Jesus, I'm not Jesus. Let's not assume that we're so perfect that we have this righteous indignation. We're going to be in the camp of falling on this side of faithlessness. So where did this generation go wrong and what can we learn from it? So we're going to talk about, first off, the faithlessness of the scribes. And we're not going to talk much about this because the scribe one is pretty obvious, right? Because we see that they saw the miracles of Jesus over and over and over again. And the Gospel of John just records that over and over. They saw this. They witnessed this. They witnessed the raised Lazarus, right? They seen Jesus heal the blind, cast out demons. And they said, oh, you're doing that by Satan. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Like this total refutation. I am not going to believe, no matter what evidence is presented before me, this can't be true. And they've just made up their minds that they're going to oppose him. And they schemed a way to kill him. They schemed ways to try to trap him instead of just, this Jesus is doing things that no human being can do. Instead of pausing and thinking, what does that mean for me? Does that mean I should maybe start listening to him because he's speaking as one who has authority, which even the crowds notice. But yet, no, they wanted their authority. So they stuck with that and opposed Jesus. What about the apostles? What about the 12 that were here arguing, or the 9, I suppose, or that were arguing with these scribes? Were the apostles able to cast out demons at this point? Yes, in Mark 3, this is before chapter 9, verse 14 through 15. And he, Jesus, appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. So whatever failure that happened here of casting out the demon from the child, is it on the part of Jesus or on the part of the disciples? Did Jesus fail to give them the correct amount of authority to be able to cast out this demon? Yeah, Jesus had given them authority. They had the power to do this granted by Jesus. And they're given direct authority by the Father, because Jesus said, I don't do anything of my will, but everything the Father wills, I do, I say. But they weren't able to cast out this demon. So what are they doing instead of successfully casting out a demon? They're arguing. They're debating back and forth with the scribes, which means where's their attention not? On this boy with the demon. Instead, they got distracted. They got engaged in this verbal altercation with the scribes of trying to explain, no, you listen here. I do have authority to cast out demons. Jesus told me so. You're wrong. Nuh-uh. And they're going back and forth debating about these things. When you can't do, argue. Right? When you can't do, argue. And that's what we see happening right here. But did the disciples know better? I would say yes, because Jesus calls them faithless, and they can help that. That's why Jesus is frustrated about this. And when he had entered the house, skip down to verse 28 of Mark 9, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Now let's look at Matthew 17, which records the parallel account, or the same account. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not cast it out? Same question, right? He said to them, because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. So was it because, and some translations say prayer and fasting in Mark 9. So was their failure because they used the wrong method of demonology? They didn't do the right steps? Or was it because of their lack of faith? Could it be possible that our prayers are a practice of faith? And conversely, by not praying, are we actively showing faithlessness? You see, I don't think it's just like, oh, well, you're supposed to fast for this period of time. I think it's just, no, you're supposed to rely on God. Prayer and fasting is a reliance on God and not on yourself. And by relying on yourself instead of God, who are you relying on? You're relying on you. And then if you rely on you instead of God, what does that mean about your faith? You don't think God can do it. So you're relying on yourself to do it. And we can see that self-reliance in their arguing with the scribes. Instead of stopping and being like, we got to figure this out. We got to help this child. Let's pray to God. Let's bring this to the Father. Instead, they're, no, we can't do it. You listen here, scribes. And they're going back and forth, and they've been totally distracted from the purpose. When the disciples were met with failure to do something they were expected to do, instead of turning to God in prayer, they turned to debate their critics. During this debate, who's suffering? The boy. There's this poor child in agony that is just totally ignored and just totally cast aside because the disciples are too busy arguing about why they're right to the scribes. Which the scribes are wrong, right? The scribes, everyone agrees, right? Everyone all in agreement, Pharisees and scribes, yeah, not good, right? They're the ones that killed Jesus. But Jesus, that doesn't mean that they were supposed to shift their attention away and just debate them. Instead of ministering to the battered sheep, they are ministering to debate those who already don't believe and those who already have made up their minds. Just like Peter on the mountain, the disciples had lost the plot. Do you remember Peter's like, oh, well, maybe let me build 3 tents, all right? And then Jesus, the Father says, listen to him. You missed it, Peter, all right? It's not what's going on here. It's not because of, Moses and Elijah. It's because this is Jesus, right? They missed the point. Do we spend more time trying to prove we are right, or do we spend more time acting right? Do we spend more time in speech or more time in action? And at times, ignoring is bliss. Ignoring, I don't know. At times, that's what happens when you read phonetically, I guess. At times, ignoring is bliss. I want you to notice in Nehemiah 6, 1 through 3, we won't read it all, but it's just this beautiful story. Remember, Nehemiah is building the walls, and there's this antagonist, right? Just making the lives miserable of the Israelites as they're trying to rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. Sanballat and Tobiah, the bad guys, right? And so they call out to Nehemiah. They send these messengers, and they're like, hey, and Nehemiah's not done with the work. He's very close, but there's still doors. There's still gaps in the wall. And then they're like, hey, come and speak with us. We have something important to talk to you about. And then notice Nehemiah's response there at the bottom. He says, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? Do you think that maybe should have been the disciples' response whenever the scribes were heckling them when they were working on this? Do you think they maybe should have just said, listen, we got more important things to do right now, right? No, I'm going to ignore that and do what Jesus told me to do and focus on acting right. So what about the Father? Why would the Father be considered faithless or as a part of this faithless generation? Because this desperate father had come to Jesus for healing, but who does he find instead? He finds the disciples. And notice this. It says, and someone from the crowd answered him, Teacher, I brought my son to you. So his target was Jesus. He was looking for Jesus, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. So nothing faithless so far, it seems, right? Just a desperate and disappointed father trying to get his son healed. What's the problem here? Well, keep reading. In verse 21, it says, and Jesus asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. And this may be an assumption, but it's possible that the failure of Jesus' disciples had caused this man to doubt the power of Jesus himself. He confused the disciples for Jesus. Well, because your disciples can't, well, maybe it's risky if you can. Maybe that shook his faith in Jesus' ability to heal his son. Has there been a time in your life when you had a big problem that you hoped Jesus would fix, only to be met with failure by Jesus' followers? Or be disappointed or hurt when you turn to Jesus' disciples and instead they hurt and compile onto the problem instead of helping you? Like, man, I thought this was part of Jesus' plan, was to have a family that was going to help me and uplift me, and instead I'm being torn down. We cannot attribute the failure of men to the infallible God. It's a mistake. Many people, including young people, have been faced with massive burdens that they are desperate to find healing for. And honestly, they're just too scared to ask it. They're just going to keep it to themselves because all they've gotten in the past is rebuke, discouragement, or just not Christ-like behavior. I'll put it that way. When they are met with hurt and disappointment from Jesus' followers, it can cause them to doubt if Jesus can really heal them. But that's an error, right? That doesn't mean just because we've been hurt by other people doesn't mean that we have some pass for our faithlessness, because faithlessness is faithlessness, no matter the source, no matter the reason. And I heard this analogy and I quite liked it. If you hear someone playing a Beethoven song and it's just horrible, like it's just horrible. If you've ever been to like those elementary like kids recitals, something, I'm sorry. Not all of them, all right, but some. I've seen them on YouTube, right? It's just terrible renditions of these classical, beautiful pieces of art. It just sounds terrible. Would it be logical to walk away and be like, man, that Beethoven guy couldn't write a lick? What a terrible musician. Of course not. Of course not. He was a genius. He was an expert composer. He was perhaps one of the most brilliant composers of all time. But what's more likely? Those kids are just performing Beethoven poorly. So when you're hurt by Jesus' disciples, Jesus is not hurting you. It's just imperfect people playing Jesus imperfectly. They're going to fail. And how hypocritical would it be of us to not be forgiving, right? When we want forgiveness, and then when someone makes a mistake, or I hear people say, well, I don't go to church anymore. They're all hypocrites. I'm like, what? And you're not? Like, what? You've never been hypocritical in your life? That sounds awful hypocritical to me. Like, yeah, there are hypocrites in the church. We've all acted hypocritically in our life. And guess what? We're repenting of that. We're working on that. We're growing in the stature and measure of Christ day by day. So you need to extend me the same grace that I should be extending you. And recognizing we're disciples, trying to reflect a perfect God, the perfect Son of God. Jesus in our minds has to be elevated above humans. We can't conflate the two. There is a reason he is called the head and his church the body, right? Because he's above. He makes the decisions. He's the guide. How did Jesus respond to the faithlessness of those around him? He rebuked, yet exhorted the Father, right? He didn't just leave him there. He didn't just yell at him and say, go away, I'm not doing anything now. He rebuked him, and then he says, help my unbelief. And what does Jesus do? Helps his unbelief, right? By healing his son. He healed the child. He educated his disciples, right? Gave them more knowledge. Gave them faith. If you had faith like this, man, you failed in that. You were faithless in that. But if you just had this much faith, you could move mountains. Is that like encouraging to you? Like you get the rebuke, the sting part, but what else do you get? You get the exhortation. You can do better. You can do so much more. And he demonstrated God's power to the crowds. The saying is trustworthy, 2 Timothy 2:11-13. The saying is trustworthy. For if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. If we deny him, he also will deny us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Luke 18:7-8, it says, and will not God give justice to his elect, who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And I think about the motif of Scripture. You see this constant theme, or this continual theme, of people crying out to God amidst their distress. We see that in Exodus, the people of Israel crying out to Yahweh to deliver them because of their slavery. They were enslaved, they were beaten, they were bruised, they were harassed, and they wanted God's deliverance. I think of Sodom and Gomorrah as another one. We forget this, but in God's dialogue with himself, with Abraham eavesdropping, that God knows he's eavesdropping on, right? It's the amazing story. God says that the outcry against that city has become great. Well, who's doing the outcrying? Well, obviously, if a city is wicked as Sodom and Gomorrah, there's going to be victims under those power structures. We just read about the bad parts of the city, but think about who were oppressed in Sodom and Gomorrah. Think about Lot, right? His righteous soul was tormented. I'm sure there were others that had been killed or slain because we know they were an anti-virtuous society. What we call good, or they would call bad. What we call bad, they would call good. It was upside down world, right? And that outcry against God, God's judgment was an act of mercy for the people crying out to him for deliverance. God's judgment is the salvation of his elect, of those who are faithful to him, that cry out to God. But Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes, because Jesus is coming back, will he find faith on earth? I find that so sad that Jesus had to say that, had to think about that. I'm doing all this work, I'm suffering all these things, in the hopes that when I return, there's going to be faith still on the earth. God's going to heal the hurting who trust in him. But he will find faithfulness. But will he find faithfulness when Jesus returns? Will he find faithless disciples bickering and debating about why they're right? Or will he find prayerful disciples who are actually serving those who are most vulnerable, those that he commanded us to take care of, to minister to? Will he find people who looked for healing but abandoned all hope at the first sign of disappointment from his disciples? Well, I wanted to follow Jesus. I wanted to do the right thing, but man, that church over there, they hurt me too bad. Well, Jesus didn't hurt you too bad. That sounds like a heart problem. And I'm sorry, I love you. If you feel that way, I love you, but get over it. People are going to hurt you, all right? Raise your hand if you've never been hurt by a Christian. No hands up, all right? No hands up. So please understand, we have all been hurt by Jesus' disciples in the past. That's not a new concept. You can look at the scripture and you can see when Israelites hurt other Israelites. And there's little infighting and there's these wars. But did God ever say, all right, you all break it up. You don't have to be around each other anymore. Just have your own isolated religion. No. Because Jesus knows, the Father knew that if we would have done better alone, he would have left us alone. And he didn't leave us alone. So I'm sorry, I love you, and I'm not minimizing that hurt. I know it can be real. I've experienced it myself. We can talk about that sometime if you want to talk about it. I'm listening. But Jesus is worth the hurt. And think about what Jesus did. Did Jesus, at the first sign of, oh, that was tough, I want to go back. I mean, he of all people had a right to do that, right? He suffered more than you ever will, than I ever will, than I could ever conceive of. And yet, when the humans were faithless, he was faithful. Worst of all, I mean this and maybe, I don't know if I mean it metaphorically or literally, I'm not sure. You decide. Will he find spectators? There was a crowd there. Remember, they were happy to see Jesus. They were amazed, like, oh, Jesus, hi. But it seems like they were just watching kind of the disciples arguing. And they're not really contributing, by the way. Just kind of watching them fight, which in and of itself isn't a reason to condemn. But do you remember what happens when Jesus casts the demon out of the boy? The crowd's watching, you know what they say? He's dead. They obviously know something's up with Jesus, right? Because he's glowing. That's why they're amazed. They greet him. And then when he casts out this demon, he casts him out, they're like, oh, he killed him. Oh. Like, is that faithlessness? I kind of count that as faithlessness. I think this whole generation was a generation of faithlessness. But the question remains, do you want to be healed? If so, you have to respond to Christ's healing in faith by dying to yourself and putting on Christ. The old way of living, remember that's what happened with Adam and Eve. They saw, this looks good. God said it was bad. It looks good to me. I'm deciding. I'm calling the shots. How'd that turn out? Death. That's what happened. There's a way that seems right unto a man, but what's the end of it? Destruction. But how do you put on Christ? Galatians 3:26, it says, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faithlessness, through faith. If you believe this, for as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. In 1 Peter 3:21, we know that baptism now saves us. And it's not just a bath, right? It's an appeal to God. That when we're buried in that water, it's our cry out to Jesus, deliver me, save me. And what will God do? He's going to deliver you. He's going to save you. And understand that when you do that, when you come to Christ in faith, he views you as a child, as his child, as the Father's child that is sick, oppressed by forces far stronger than you can even think of, and he wants to deliver you and heal you from that. Mark 9:27, but Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. That can be you. That can be you. And if you are a saint, that is you. So guess what? Endure. Endurance, endurance, endurance. We read that all throughout the scripture. We read that in Hebrews, Revelation, just this idea of overcome, conquer. Yes, it's going to be tough. Yeah, people are going to disappoint you. Yeah, you're going to deal with church hurt. We all have. It's a part of life. It's part of the walk. But you remain faithful to God. You remain faithful to Jesus above everything else, above every relationship, over every hurt, over every anxiety. You trust him enough to seriously let him transform you. So you may fall in a different camp this morning. You may be a disciple who's more concerned about arguing and debating and then serving and doing what God has told us to do. You may be a scribe here this morning that's just decided no matter what happens, no matter what evidence I've shown, no matter how many people plead with me, I'm deciding that he's not Jesus. He's not my Messiah. Consider the possibility that you could be wrong. That maybe you're not perfect. That maybe you're not God. Maybe you don't know what's good and evil. Or maybe you're the crowd. Maybe you're just happy to sit in the pew, watch, not make a fuss, not make a stir, not study my Bible, not pray, but make my appearances, show up, look good, everything else, and you're just a spectator. Christ doesn't want spectators. He wants children that will serve in his kingdom, that will behave like Jesus. If you have any need, if you'd like to become a Christian, if you'd like to become a child of God, we ask that you please come forward and be baptized as we stand to sing number 29.